Hello everyone, welcome back to Cost Streams TV. It is the end of Season 2, and the new thing that we've started to do is keep track of all of our Mythic Plus runs, and we started this in Season 1, and we made a review video at the end of the season, so we're going to repeat that again this season. We're going to jump into the sheet, and we're going to take a look at what the season actually looked like. At the very end of the video, I'll do a side-by-side comparison to show you guys what Season 1 looked like, what Season 2 looked like, what the differences may be, and then I'll give a brief rundown of my thoughts of the dungeon pool, my thoughts of the season as a whole, and then just any last minute things to finish off the video. If you're interested in taking a look at the sheet that I'll be presenting or just want to follow along, it is down in the description below. Feel free to just go click the link and you can see it for yourself. And if the sheet is something you want to use in the future, let me know down in the description below. I can do a quick tutorial on how to copy the tabs out into your own spreadsheet, and you can start doing the same thing. And so with that, let's jump into the stats. Let's jump into the numbers. What you're looking at here is the first tab. At the bottom of the sheet, there will be multiple tabs. You've got your season 1, season 2, and I'm still working on the season 3. Most likely by the time this video goes live and people are looking at it, that tab will be updated as well. But this is the season 2 tracker that I like to use, the statistics, my stat library, so to speak. And in this, it has the date I ran the key, all the different dungeons that I ran, and it's just a simple drop down menu so I can pick the dungeon, the key level we ran at, whether it was upgraded, +1, 2, 3, a completion, or a disband, which week we ran it on, what the primary affix was, right? So there's Ascendant, Pulsar, which replaced Oblivion, Devour, and Voidbound. So those are the 4 affixes that Blizzard brought in, and the spec that I actually ended up playing. And then to the right of that is the class representation that came into the key. So we have which tank I was on, the healers that came with me, and the DPS specs that I brought. Also, a little bit more to the right, just for my own information, I actually put down if I did the key with a team. Anything that has nothing in it means I did it solo. I just plugged the key, but the ones that say team means I had a full 5-man group that I was running with. So there are a few keys there, and I did that because I was curious to see if those keys were or were not successful, right? So some of the group keys for the most part were successful. Early on in the season, we had a lot of completions and, you know, some disbands, but it was an overall good season. My main was blood for the season, so there'll be a lot of blood keys, but that is the primary tab. If you're curious to see the breakdown of specs or how this looks, this is where you can find that, and it goes all the way into the final week that I ran keys, which would have been the 3rd of August. That was the last key that I did. I don't plan on doing any more keys. The release after this video goes live, patch 11.2 will have been released, so there's no reason to kind of do any more after that. But that is what the first tab looks like. This is where I keep track all the keys I do, and this is what actually feeds the next tab that we're going to look at. This tab here is the tab that collects that data and puts into a more presentable format with percentages and stuff that we can look at and understand. At any point in the video, please feel free to just pause it and take a look at the numbers if you want to break it down a little more. I'm not going to do like a full week by week comparison, class by class comparison. This is more of a high level just to show you guys what the season looked like for me, what are the classes we ran with. But let's start at the very top, the overall runs completed. So this season in season 2, we attempted a total of 393 keys. Now I say attempted because not all of them were completed. Our overall percentages are right here. 292 successful keys, meaning 74% of our keys were successful, and I believe that's an improvement over season 1. 40 of our keys were just completed, so only about 10% of the almost 400 keys were completion keys, and then 15% were disbands. Now this is a big improvement over season 1, and I do believe the changes that Blizzard made to the scaling of the dungeons to go from 11 to 12 in season 2 made a huge difference and impacted how much smoother the curve was to get into those higher keys. I think 12 kind of became the new 10, and those were the keys that we really aimed to run. And then overall, at a very high level, we look at our completed, depleted keys and finished keys. 332 finished keys in a combination of disbands and completions is about 25%. The next section that we look at here is our weekly keys. So it has every week broken down, and then it kind of tracks from the previous sheet that I showed you, the disbands, the completions, the upgrades, then the total amount of keys ran that week. As you can see, starting early on in the season, we really did knock out a ton of keys. Like, I was really motivated. I wanted to do keys, so we're really knocking out a lot of keys, and it was fun. It really was a good season. I truly believe this was probably one of the better seasons. However, with all the power boosts and all the different things we got, my desire to play really started to falter, and I just wasn't really that eager to log in. Both my warrior, my demon hunter, and my paladin ended up getting high levels really quickly, and we're at max, and I just really didn't feel like playing. We got 3k on 2 different tanks, which was the Demon Hunter and the DK, and then the prop paladin is close to that, but he's also 683. So we really stopped playing as much. But taking a look at some of the like disband percentages, it looks like our biggest week for disbands is right here at week 11. But if you look at the numbers, it's only 8 disbands out of a total of 23 keys ran, right? So really not that bad. At the beginning of season 2, you would think we'd have a lot more disbands, but because we were running more with like a group of people, we had more completions because the goal was to finish keys to get that loot at the end. So definitely a lot more completions moving into the beginning of the season. But then as the season really progressed, the disband numbers really dropped off. Like there wasn't many disbands. There's a little more in the completion range, but the disbands really did drop off as, you know, the keys, I don't want to say they got easier, but the scaling kind of did make sense and people were able to just blast through the keys. They may have been difficult keys because, or, you know, really tight on the timer because people were playing poorly, or because of all the gear acquisition and eye level acquisition, people who shouldn't be doing 12s and higher ended up doing 12s and higher. So, you know, they're not kicking, they're not interrupting, they're standing in everything. So it definitely became a little more of a stressful season, but, you know, disbands and completions did really fall off a cliff, but we were able to upgrade a lot of keys, right? And that is kind of one of the other things I added to this actual chart is on the right here, I did a lower affix column, and this basically is what key, if you're doing sub 10, was the affix, whether it was of tyrannical or fortified, because it's rotated every week. And something we'll be doing in season 3 is we're going to be adding the releases of everything. So when did the patch go live? When did the 0.5 patch come out? When did 0.7? And if they're adding all these extra things, I'm going to start documenting it here so we can keep track of when all these power gains were occurring throughout the season. Moving right along, we jump into the representation section of the document. Now, this is the representation of all of the specs and classes I ran with over the season. So it doesn't matter whether it's an upgrade, a disband, or completion. There are separate tables that will show you which classes I had successful upgrades with, which are the most I disbanded with and completed with. So those are below. But this is the one that just counts everything. This is the one that I find very interesting because it shows you who did I run with the most, what specs were represented often, and you can really see that here. So on the left, the initial breakdown goes by specs. So if classes have multiple specs, this is where you'll find that. It gives you the amount of times I ran with that spec, and then it gives you kind of the overall percentage of how often we saw them, right? And then to the right of that is the actual just collapsed version of that, where instead of going by spec, we go by the specific class. So Death Knight, Druid, all of their specs combined into one, and then it just gives you a total count of what we had. There are definitely some numbers that are very high here. For example, Hunters, Mages, and Paladins seem to once again be the most common DPS classes that we ran with Warlocks not far behind. So this is a great representation of everything that we ran. The percentages are here. Taking a look at the healers we ran with, definitely a significant breakdown here, but the meta healer was definitely identified early this season. It was the same one at the end of season 1, and that's right, it was the Disc Priest. So we have lots of keys with Disc Priest, followed behind by the Resto Chamois, right? And then just down here, there's actually a table, a graph representation. If you were curious what this actually looks like, that breaks down the different healer classes that we ran with. Really easy to see if you just kind of want to quickly glance at what the total numbers were. You can see that here without the percentages. Now, evokers were down bad. When I saw an evoker, I actually did a 12 with evoker, which was extremely surprising because they were rare. They were ancient creatures, dragons from afar that we almost never saw. And then a pretty even breakdown between Druid and Monk. Both Druid and Monk felt very good, honestly, to do keys with. Like, I had no issues. There's some you know, questionable druids that I ran with, but this was like later in the season when you're doing some lower keys and stuff. But you know, that's meant to happen. Obviously, Disc taking the reign. Holy Paladin felt fine. I had no concerns running with a Holy Paladin. They also bring that battle res, which is always nice. And then Holy Priest, just you didn't really see a lot of him this season either. With Disc being the meta healer, when you saw a Holy Priest queue, you usually just wouldn't invite them, right? So Holy Priest down bad, Evoker down bad, but this is what the representation looks like. And then let's talk about the tanks that I ran. So this season, I specifically made a decision that I was only going to do keys on a tank. I didn't run any DPS. I didn't run any healers whatsoever. Every single key I did, I was the tank. And this is a breakdown of all of the tanks I played. Now, DK was my primary for raid. This is the one that I got CE on initially. And then what I started to do is I played Demon Hunter after, just to see, hey, you know, if this is the meta tank, well, why? And boy, did I quickly learn why. This tank was just unkillable and it could survive everything. So we did a bunch of keys on both the DK and the Demon Hunter. And then looking a little further down, the next closest thing was the Paladin. Now, something that we did do this season, we did get 2,500, at least 2,500 on all our tanks, except the monk. The monk is the only one, but it didn't take a lot of keys to get there. It took us maybe 30 keys. So both the warrior and the druid are sitting at 2,500, and those are the amount of keys it took to get there. It wasn't very hard, or they got it at around 650 eye level. So, and then the monk just kind of fell off because I main monk in season 1. I just didn't have that drive to get back in there. And I think by the end of the season, after playing so many other tanks, I really didn't have the drive to push the monk up to that 2,500. But overall, this is just a breakdown of every tank that we ran. The tanks that felt completely unkillable were definitely the demon hunter and the druid, and the tanks that I actually had fun with was the DK when you're not getting melee to death, and the prop paladin is a tank that I started to really learn. So I've had a lot of fun playing keys on the prop paladin, as I've never mained one. So it's been a new experience playing prop paladin, but it's a lot of fun. So that is the breakdown of all of the tanks we played. Now, if you want to see a visual representation of all of the specs that we played without looking at the table, we're going to take a look at that next. And the first bar graph we're going to look at is the spec representations. This is a breakdown of every single spec, just visually easy to read and see. Kind of shows you what are some of the specs we played with without looking at the percentage. Afflock, down bad. Subtlety Rogue, down bad. I'm surprised I played with 21 Shadow Priest. That is a huge surprise. And Survival and Og also down bad. So Og, I'm not surprised because they nerfed this class down to the absolute ground. But I did do some keys with a friend of mine who played Og, and this is why you see the Og Voker in some of our spec representation, but you can see some of the classes that really just didn't see a lot of play this season at all. So, and then the next chart we're going to take a look at, this actually does the overall DPS numbers. So this is a representation of that combined group and just showing the classes that we played. So kind of the ones sitting at the highest are the hunters, the mages, and the paladins, not followed closely behind by warlocks, right? So overall, not bad. If you look at class representation, priests, as I said, because disc was meta, you don't really see a lot of shadow priests, and then monk, you just don't really see a lot of windwalkers. I would invite monks because I have a soft spot for windwalkers, so that's why you see them there. And overall, this is kind of the numbers you see. Devokers came around quite a bit because they were a little fun to play with, but there's just definitely better classes and more people playing some of the ones that you see here at the top. So this is the overall breakdown of the classes, the DPS classes that we ran with. And the next two sections are the ones that I mentioned, where you get the breakdown of what classes and specs I ran with that I successfully upgraded keys with, and what classes and specs I ran with that caused disbands. If you're curious to see what these numbers look like, please feel free to pause the screen now and take a look, or if you want to just kind of look at the spreadsheet on your own time, feel free to do so. But this is a nice breakdown of all the different classes and specs I ran with. The ones obviously that are higher in the representation will have a larger number here as well, but then you can also see my tank specs that I ran with and how many I was successful with. And this is a representation of all key levels from 2 all the way up to 14. So there is no distinction between 12s. That is a little further down in the sheet. And then the same thing for the disbands. We can see how many tanks, healers, and classes representation that we had for disbanded keys. The next chart I want to look at, this is the one that will be a little more interesting. This is the 12s and higher only. So this now is just with Xal'atath's Guile. And Xal'atath's Guile changed this season. So instead of being a flat DPS and health increased to all the mobs, Xal'atath's Guile now included the 15-second death timer, so creating a very smooth progression curve for Mythic Plus. And this is the breakdown of the keys that we completed. So out of 393 keys, 117 of these keys were 12 or higher. So I think my highest key was a 14, so we did get a few of those done. And this breaks down the representation of the DPS spec, the class combined together, and then the healers and tanks that I ran on, right? So here's a breakdown of those numbers. Now, when we jump into this level, the numbers seem to change a little. Hunters, mages, and paladins aren't our top percentage specs anymore. We start seeing more chamois, more warlocks, more rogues, where mage and paladin actually dropped off. Mage was a meta spec, but it turns out I didn't run with a lot of them. We have a hunter, but hunters still seem to be very high because they always bring lust, right? So you can have those BM hunters bringing lust, and it really does help fill out the comp if you don't have a chamois mage or evoker in the group. So they really do fill out that last spot with lust. It's kind of nice. Right, so that's the breakdown of spec class, and then we look at the healers that we ran with. Disc Priest definitely ruling the roost, which is no surprise whatsoever. They really did feel safe running with Disc Priest, and then closest behind it is only at 18 keys with a Resto Sham. So those numbers are really, really small. So definitely you can see where the meta was there. And then for me, my tank representation, 4 of my tanks managed to go in and do some 12. So we have the DH and the DK fairly close together when it comes to doing the same amount of 12s. And then we have the Paladin who's run a few, and the Druid that even got a few 12s and up done. So definitely felt the safest on the Druid and the Demon Hunter. Once again, in 12 and up keys, they feel like they are unkillable tanks. So this is the breakdown of our 12 and higher statistics. And one of the new tables that I've created is the runs by affix. So similar to all the other statistics that we maintain, this one now keeps track of the different affixes that we have. So if you're doing a 2 through 2 and a 3, it's only a timer, right? So even though it's not an affix, I added timer only keys because we did do them, especially when we're starting to gear characters who are low. I do start with 2s and 3s just to get some easy vaults out of them, right? So I added that in here. We have the 4 affixes that Blizzard brought, and then Xal'atath's Guile for 12 and higher. So this is a high level representation of what that looks like. Obviously, the highest disbands being in Guile makes perfect sense because of how many 12 keys that we did. It is our largest number. The closest second looks like to be Voidbound, but it is only 55 total keys ran on it, right? So this is a nice breakdown of that. If you're curious to see what it looks like in just a representation, this is the represented version of all of the affixes that we ran and the weeks that we ran the most. And depending on that week's affix is where these numbers come from, right? So 73 for Devour, 73 for Ascendant, and of course Guile ruling the roost, as 12s were the way to go for most keys when you're looking for vaults. And then let's jump in and talk about our dungeon statistics. This is the dungeon pool that we had for season 2. So every dungeon is on the left here. And then same thing, we track our disbands, completions, our upgrades, total keys, rans, and then the percentage of that. Taking a look at some of these keys, our highest disbanded key was Priory at 42 total ran, which doesn't really surprise me. Priory was one of those keys that if that first pull went poorly, most people would just immediately leave. And sometimes it did go poorly. It wasn't always the smoothest pull. You had sharpshooters attacking people, the AoE killing someone, healer getting randomly attacked and jumped to. So there was challenges with that key, and I'm not surprised that it's sitting at the highest disband percentage. And then followed by the highest number of disbands is actually Cinderbrew, but we did a lot of Cinderbrew keys, right? So really, realistically, from the amount of keys done and the percentage of our disbands, it's not that bad. Priory is the worst, followed closely Bly, Floodgate, and Cinderbrew, Meadory. And if we look at the deplete percentage, this is basically a combination of our disbands and our completions over our total number of keys. So our highest, of course, sitting once again at Priory. But if you look at the numbers, it's really not a lot. It's only 42 total keys ran. So the two numbers there, you add them together, it is about almost, it is about 40% of the keys. So something to keep in mind when you're looking at the percentages, they won't always be the greatest representation depending on the amount of keys we ran. But this is a breakdown of all of the keys ran at the percentage level. Then we also have the graph that breaks down all of the dungeons using a nice bar example to show you our highest ran. I am actually surprised that Cinderbrew Meadory ended up being my highest ran key at 71, but it kind of makes sense because the neck in Cinderbrew was BIS for my DK and my paladin, and I had to run a ton of those keys to try to get it, and it had a few other items that were good as well that we could use. So Cinderbrew Meadory definitely sitting pretty high, followed by Operation Floodgate and Darkflame Cleft. Now I figured Darkflame Cleft would be higher because it's that key that was super easy, that you can go in, you can take your time, even with a not great group. It was easy to time. So I'm really surprised that Darkflame Cleft wasn't higher, and it actually lines up with Operation Floodgate. Operation Floodgate, in my opinion, great addition to season 2. Extremely fun dungeon, really big pulls. You had options to go right or left. Really, realistically, it didn't matter which way you went. And overall, just a well-paced dungeon. I think Blizzard adding a new dungeon like this into the pool in season 2 was a great idea. This dungeon turned out very well. And then we have Rookery in 4th place, which again, it was one of those dungeons that was fairly simple. Even at high keys, it was quick to do, 3 bosses, but it was often that you can get to that last boss, and certain affixes didn't play well with the position because you're spread out so far. So Pulsar was a bad one because you have to run through everyone's orbs. Voidbound was bad too because it would spawn on the tank and the DPS on the other side of the room wouldn't always run over. So those two just did not play well with that last boss in Rookery. When you're doing affix keys at 12 and higher is fairly easy, and then Priory being my lowest dungeon out of the recent dungeon pool, so none of the returning dungeons. That makes sense. Priory was one of those scary keys. Really, everything hit hard. There's so many casters. The routing sometimes is difficult. People would butt pull. Things would happen. So I'm not surprised that Priory is sitting at 42. And then my least ran dungeons are the 3 returning dungeons. No surprise whatsoever there. The only reason I really even ran Theater of Pain is because of some of the rings you can get and the trinkets. Viserys Heart was actually not bad to have early on in the season as a tank. And then, you know, even though Mechagon wasn't long, it was not a dungeon I enjoyed running. I've had enough of Mechagon over the seasons since it's been released. And then Motherlode just felt like a slog of a dungeon. I absolutely did not like running Motherlode. I didn't like going there. It was my least favorite dungeon. So I am not surprised that the 3 returning dungeons have the least amount of play. They were the 3 I just didn't enjoy playing whatsoever. So no surprise there at all. And last up, let's jump in and do a side-by-side comparison of Season 1 to Season 2 and see how these numbers line up. Let's start off just by taking a look at the total number of runs ran. Significant difference compared to Season 1 versus Season 2. There is a delta of about 44 keys between the seasons, and it looks like at the end of Season 1, if we start looking at some of these last few weeks, we've got some big numbers. Week 20, 21, 22, and 23, probably a total of 57 keys ran. So for some reason at the end of Season 1, I was either probably gearing another tank or just enjoying the end of the season, whereas if we look at Season 2, we did a total of 11 keys. Really big difference there at the end of the season. Like I said, Season 2 just no longer had the desire to keep pushing keys. So definitely a big difference there. Taking a look at the disband percentages though, this is a nice change to see. Instead of 100 disbands, 1 in every 4, we have 61. 15% versus 22% when it comes to disbands. And then our upgrade numbers are much higher now in Season 2 with the smooth difficulty curve. So another breakdown, if you want to pause the screen, take a look, you can take a look at that. Let's jump in and take a look at the DPS representation. We're going to look at the graphs because they're easy to read and follow. And here we have the overall DPS spec and class representation. First, let's take a look at the specs. If you look at the chart, it really does change. Unholy up good in Season 2, down bad in Season 1. Frost down, up good in Season 1, down bad in Season 2. Paladins continue to rule the roost. Hunters also look pretty good. BM really shooting up last season, where survival dropped down quite a bit. And then we also have Rogue, kind of a little more spaced out in Season 2, where Heat Spec got a little bit of play, whereas in Season 1 we just saw a lot of assassination rogues and no subtly rogues whatsoever. Warlock doesn't seem to have changed much outside of the total numbers of Warlocks ran with. The chart itself actually looks pretty much the same, with AF still being down bad. Arms though getting some more play in Season 2. So really interesting spec breakdown. If we're looking at this, you know, here we see Devastation up good in Season 2, down bad in Season 1. Og up in Season 1, which we totally expect, down bad in Season 2. So really interesting seeing these numbers. Some classes stay the same, like Chamois, for example, you know, Enhance still up, Elemental kind of mid, and that's how it looks in Season 2 as well. And then just moving down a little bit, we can take a look at the class representation. Here's just the higher breakdown, but we can see, you know, Warlocks, Paladins, Mages, and Hunters up good in Season 1, and that kind of stays the same in Season 2, with actually Hunters going up even higher in Season 2. So overall spec representation for most classes, it looks pretty similar, I would say. You know, even Evoker, for having been played so little, they just flipped which spec was brought more to keys. Mages still fairly even. Hunters definitely had a lot more representation, and then Warlocks, I would say, still pretty much stay the same, right? So overall, so that is the DPS representation for both specs and classes. And let's take a look at our healers. Taking a look at the healer breakdown, we really see a difference in the meta. Last season I played with a Chamois in Season 1, right? So that's not surprising that we see the Chamois up high and then Disc Priest slowly climbing near the end of the season. In Season 2, we absolutely knew who the meta healer was, so we knew that Disc was going to definitely dominate the Mythic Plus charts, and that is exactly what we have with Chamois not fall behind. Still, you see Evokers down bad, Paladins down bad, Monks down bad. They're pretty much all even across the spec. I forgot to add Druids. We had 35 Druids in Season 1, so it kind of sits in between the Monk and the Paladin chart, 50 in Season 2. So those 3 specs still feel somewhat the same season over season. And that, gamers, is the end of our Season 2 Mythic stats library breakdown. This season really did start off with a bang. It was extremely fun to play. Things felt really good. The progression curve was spot on. The changes to the affixes I thought were very well done, and it really made it less miserable. Like, I'm glad Oblivion went away. Oblivion was the one where all the orbs would come to you and you had to kind of soak them if they hit ads. Because of the way the ads moved, it was really hard to, like, they would randomly jolt and the orb would spin around. So moving that into Pulsar, where the orb is now around you and you have to run through it with someone, really made for some interesting gameplay and comms when you're asking someone to run through your ball. You know, that definitely made it a fun affix to play with when you're playing with a group of friends. Voidbound, still a fairly simple affix. The ad spawns, you have to kill it. The only challenges were when the group had to be split apart and people wouldn't come over and help you kill the affix because it would spawn on the tank. We have Devour, which I still think is the worst of the affixes. This is the one where you have to dispel or heal off the shield that Devour puts on the player. Now, you would think that now this the second season that this affix exists and people would know that they can dispel it. Unfortunately, that is not the case. Still, many classes have no idea that they can use their dispel. You would think the second season with this affix would mean that players would know how to deal with it. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And then the last affix that Blizzard just kind of kept in place was Ascendant. That is the one where all the cosmic orbs just drop and you have to AoE interrupt them, which I think that one is still great, easy to work with, easy to deal with. For the most part, most players have learned to understand that one, and because the benefit of haste is there, people definitely want to actually interact with it. So I think the changes to the affix system were phenomenal. I think moving forward, Blizzard should maintain this type of system. It even at lower keys, it doesn't make the keys feel miserable to run, or, you know, oh my god, I have to skip this week because it's Ascended or it's Devour. Like, there isn't, you know, that doesn't really exist, especially now with 12s and Guile and you only have the timer affix. It's really easy to, once you get to those 12 keys, you run 12s, right? And 12 has become the new 10, which I don't think is a bad thing. Honestly, I do think that 12's not having any affix to deal with feels really good. You can just play the dungeon, which I really do enjoy, not having to deal with a silly affix. It's funny because at the end of the season, we would join keys on alts and the affix would spawn and all of us would go, oh, right, there's an affix, because we would forget we would do so many 12s. That was kind of the go-to key. Even on alts, we would just say, hey, if we're going to help your alt, just let's take him to this 12. It's super easy. So 12s definitely became the new 10. I'm okay with that, but it did make it a little frustrating by the end of the season because there's people doing 12s that shouldn't be doing 12s whatsoever, which I discussed earlier in the video. Speaking to the dungeon pool, let's touch on some of the dungeons. I mentioned earlier in the video Operation Floodgate. I absolutely loved that dungeon. It had really big pulls at the beginning, and throughout the dungeon, early on you went right to go to Big Mama, and then later you went left to go to the dual boss, which was actually just fine, right? So because by the time you would pop lust on that first pull, you go kill a boss, you get to Big Mama, you've got lust again. So I really did enjoy the flow of that dungeon, the pacing of that dungeon. Really do like the fact that Blizzard brought in a new dungeon instead of bringing in a returning dungeon in season 2. And the other thing I'm excited for is in season 3 they did the same thing. They add a new dungeon instead of just bringing in returning dungeons. So I'm really excited to see how that plays out. I hope the new dungeon is just as good as Floodgate was. Cinderbrew Meadory also had really nice big pulls, especially the room just before IPA. I did some pretty unique things where I would pull the entire left side and pull it out. If it went well, we ended up getting all of the exploding barrels and had no challenges, but there were times where those barrels would go off and we ended up wiping. But I really did enjoy the flow of that dungeon as well. You can just kind of keep going. Later in the season with my paladin, I had Eye of Kazan, and the challenge would be do not lose your 20 stacks of Eye of Kazan, and that would be a one pull dungeon where you would just keep chaining and chaining and chaining. The only time you would drop your stacks is when you have to take the B up to the final boss. It was a lot of fun doing that in Cinderbrew Meter. Darkflame Cleft, this is the dungeon that was like your de facto go-to, easy to time. The first 12 you're going to get, not really much of a challenge, and you just really couldn't mess it up as long as you took your time. Even especially early, you would always time that key. Last boss sometimes was hit or miss. I've had a few keys where people just had no idea what they were doing. I went in to do a quick 12 one night. I needed exactly 20 pressed. We went in to do the 12, super smooth run. We're gonna 2-chest it. We get to the last boss and nobody knew what they were doing. Nobody was getting candles, so the fear continuously kept going off, and then we ended up wiping 3 or 4 times, and unfortunately we didn't even end up finishing that key. The group just disbanded, which was not a surprise there. So even though the key was easy, if you didn't know what you were doing on that last boss, it became a major challenge. There's also times I wouldn't get dispelled on attacks. Healers had no idea they could spell me. So that was a challenge sometimes as well. Then we have Priory of the Sacred Flame, my most feared dungeon. I am a little concerned with it coming back in season 3, but the reason I didn't like it is because of all of the casts you had to deal with. The pulls, it was really easy to walk by a pack and accidentally butt pull it early on in the season, and then just I struggled with the routing a little earlier. Now that's a me problem, but just kind of the routing and getting the right packs in and being able to ensure I have aggro on things, because like early to middle of the season, aggro was just a problem. Threat was a problem, and Blizzard kept buffing threat. The fact that it was a problem for so long really it made me really uncomfortable with that key, because so often the tank would get flamed because of losing threat and DPS dying. So it's just one of those keys I didn't like doing. I got a little more comfortable with it later, and I think once people understood, hey, don't attack stuff at the beginning, let the tank get into position, it got a little smoother after that. The Rookery is another one of those dungeons that was really that was simple to do it with a good group, and you could just, the pacing was just fine. You didn't have to rush. It had some nice big pulls, but the bosses did become challenging. Like if you didn't know, if on the second boss people didn't know how to deal with the debuff and just passed it between each other, DPS would always die almost instantly the second they got that second tick of the debuff. And then the last boss was one of those as well, where if it's a simple boss, but again, if you miss breaking one of the crystals, if the DPS check isn't there, if that boss just took forever. That was one of the, I think, longest bosses of the season. Sometimes it just felt like you're there for 5-6 minutes, especially at hierarchies. Again, not a hard boss, but it wasn't exactly that easy either, right? We had a lot of wipes in those keys, people not being to keep up. I've had people run off the edge, which was kind of funny. So Rookery, overall a good key. It was one of those I would pick to go in, quickly blast out a 12, a 10 or a 12, because it was also a 29-minute timer, right? So it's one of those keys that if it went well, you're getting it done quickly, but if it went poorly, you're well into that 30-minute mark, and you should have just went and done a Cinderbrew instead. Theater of Pain, I absolutely hated that key. Theater of Pain was extremely disliked. It just, the timer felt super tight early on. And I remember some of the 13s I timed were just by the skin of my teeth, with like 30 seconds left, 15 seconds left. I did not like that key at all. Extremely frustrating, extremely long. There's no skips. There's so much RP. Just a terrible dungeon, in my opinion, to bring back this season. It was one I didn't want to run at all. And then also having 5 bosses, just it made it feel like such a slog. Having to do weird like roar skips or gate skips, it was just one of those like, this should have not been a returning dungeon, but here we are. And then also we had Workshop. Not a terrible key. That first pull was always fun with the changes they made. It had good pulls over it and all that. Overall, Workshop had a steady pace to it. It wasn't one of those miserable keys that we had to do, but at the end of it, having had done this dungeon now for like its 3rd or 4th returning time, I really think Blizzard could have used something other than Workshop. We've kind of had enough of it. Both Junkyard and Workshop have been back enough. They really need to just leave those dungeons on the back burner for a while now. There's no reason for them to return. I understand the whole Goblin theme, blah, 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 but in my opinion, Workshop was a little overplayed. I didn't want to go into it. And it really, for the classes that I played, it didn't have anything that I needed. And that kind of leads into Motherlode. Again, one of those keys that had literally nothing for what I needed for my classes, and one of my least favorite ran keys. It just felt like a long dungeon, even though that first pull was great, your big first pull. Later on in the season, people wanted to skip the whole first pack, so you're trying to skip around the pack. People would butt pull, and then too many ads would get pulled. People wouldn't stun the mech jockey. He'd pick up the peacekeeper. It became really one of those keys where it was just frustrating. It was either over very early, or you'd get super far into it, and people would start dying on the last boss because they wouldn't move, or they wouldn't know the tech to kind of stand in a certain spot. I eventually started moving the boss. I just couldn't trust people to actually not die to the AoE circle, so I would move the boss into a safe spot because people just did not understand where to stand on the grate. So that was something that I would do later, but again, one of those keys, just I had no reason to run it. It wasn't very fun, and it just felt like a slog. So Motherlode and Theater of Pain, in my opinion, were just absolute slogs of dungeon, and felt like they took an eternity to complete. The overall dungeon pool was good though, in my opinion. Outside of the returning dungeons, I did enjoy playing most of the dungeons this season. So my overall thoughts on season 2 were actually a thumbs up, even though I think by the end of the season, because I only played a tank, I got burned out, and that's why I played less, because I just didn't want to log in and tank. And personally, just some of the pugs that I was experiencing, especially in the last few weeks of the season, it was just extremely painful. It was extremely frustrating, and I just, I didn't want to go into season 3 frustrated or with that like, I don't want to do these keys type of feeling. So I decided to take that break, and I think it's healthy to take a break at the end of the season. I've achieved the goals that I wanted. I hit 3K on 2 different tanks, even though 3K was super easy to get. I'm not saying that's a huge huge accomplishment, but you know, 3 tanks are a 680 plus. I've got 2 tanks at 3k, and all but 1 tank are 2500 or higher, right? So I think overall it was a very good season, enjoyable to play. The tuning and pacing were very well done by Blizzard, and you know, they did much better than they did in season 2 over season 1, because in season 1 it just felt like they released the dungeon pools and disappeared for 6 months, whereas in season 2 it did feel like they were kind of watching the Mythic Plus pool, making changes as the season went on, and it did feel like a much smoother progression curve. So I'm really happy with that. So overall, I thought season 2 was a success. That's outside of all the random stuff they brought in. So outside of, you know, bringing in visions and giving us a head enchant, bringing in the belt at the end of the season, excluding that, I think the season was very well. If you include those, I think the season fell out of favor for me because of that, because we had the turbo boost, because we had the visions, because we now get the belt. To me, that made the season miserable, especially from a pugging perspective. Groups wouldn't have felt the pain of pugging, so it's very different. But if you were a pugger, you really saw the quality of players and hierarchies just get worse and worse with every little bit of power they were giving to these individuals. So outside of that, season 2 is great. With all those things, it fell out of favor with me, but I am looking forward to season 3. I'm excited for season 3. I think the dungeons are looking great. It sounds like tanks are going to be more survivable, and I'm excited just for new content overall. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Down in the description below, there is going to be a link to the season 1 video if you're curious to see what that looked like, and there's also a link to the spreadsheet that I presented here that you guys can look at, review. Feel free to copy the tab out into your own spreadsheet and then start doing your own tracking if it's something you're interested in. It really did help me kind of just take a look at the season objectively and from a different lens and not get so frustrated. It also helps to kind of see these are the meta things that are happening, and it lines up with what you see in the community as well. So anyway, that is it. Goodbye, season 2. It was fun, but nice knowing you. I'm looking forward to season 3, and that's where we're going to see you guys next time on the next one. Peace out, gamers.